Hello and welcome to Skynet Today's Last Week in AI podcast, where you can hear us chat about what's going on with AI. As usual, in this episode, we will summarize and discuss some of last week's most interesting AI news. You can also check out our Last Week in AI newsletter at lastweekin.ai for articles we did not cover in this episode. I am one of your hosts, Andrei Kurenkov. I am just about done with my PhD at Stanford studying AI, and I'm now working at an AI startup.
By the way, what do you have to do before your intro sounds like I am now done with my PhD at Stanford? Is that just the defense?
I still need to submit my dissertation. So I did the defense, but I need to polish up my dissertation and submit it so everything is officially done.
Okay. I was just wondering because every time I hear that, I'm like, man, when is that going to happen for him? I don't know. But
I know. Nice. Almost.
Sorry,
1 month.
That's a jerk thing to say too, right? I mean, hey,
no, it's a reasonable question.
Question.
Why am I not done if I'm already working at a startup? Yeah.
Come on, Andre. Cool. Yeah. No. Anyway, thanks for the deets. Hey everyone, I'm Jeremy. And in case you hadn't noticed, my voice is the voice of the other podcast host here. So I work for a company called Gladstone AI that I co-founded. It's all about AI safety. I have a book. It's called Quantum Physics Made Me Do It. Available at fine bookstores everywhere. Cool. What do we have this week, Andre?
Oh, we have, as usual, quite a bit. So we are going to start structuring things a little bit differently. We've been kind of informally mentioning reviews and comments in the last couple of weeks. And now we've realized, we might as well just make a whole section at the beginning before we get to the news, just responding to a couple of comments or corrections. And then we also are adding a listener question segment at the end. So every week we're going to pick out one topic or question that was sent in and spend maybe 10, 15 minutes addressing it and discussing it. So yeah, hopefully that's going to be a lot of fun. And also new, we are now selling out. We're going to have a little ad, but I think this one is actually a very good fit. So we're not, selling vitamins or something. So let's go ahead and get that done with. The ad is for the No Priors podcast. So this is a podcast with interviews of people in AI. It's co-hosted by Ella Gill and Sarah Guo, who have a lot of background in industry and venture capital. And they talk to leading AI researchers and founders and ask questions like how far away is AGI, what markets are at risk for disruption, all this sort of stuff. And No Priors is out now. They have maybe, I think, a bunch of episodes with very cool people that are interviewed. So if you want to hear people in AI, that might be a good option.
By the way, I love that we're at the point in the timeline where the everyday podcasts, how far do you think AGI is? And which entire market segments are going to get nuked? That's, I guess, where we are today. So.
Fun fact, by the way. So any money we earned for Last Week in AI from the Substack and this current ad, most of it that we spend goes to subscribing to magazines and publishing. So New York Times or The Atlantic. To actually not get paywalled, we subscribe to tens of these. So if you're giving us money, you're helping journalists, I guess.
Also, we're both sporting an awful lot of bling right now, just gratuitous amounts of bling.
Oh yeah, we're making so much money, we don't really need day jobs anymore. But also, since we have this little ad for No Priors, we might as well mention a couple other podcasts we like that include interviews with AI researchers. So I'll list a few. First is the Gradient podcast. I've actually started that one a while back, I think maybe 2 years ago, and did a bunch of interviews with a lot of AI researchers. We dive kind of deeply into the technical side of things, and now it's hosted by someone else, but still really good variety of people. Similarly, Robot Brains, hosted by, what's his name? Peter Abil. Peter Abil is a professor at Berkeley who is very, very influential and very prolific. And he talks to a lot of AI researchers and some people in industry also. So yeah, I think those two are pretty cool resources if you want to hear from people working in AI right now, in addition to No Priors.
Fantastic. All right. Well, with our selling out now complete, with our bling well earned and our magazine subscriptions paid for, what does this week look like, Andre? Is this another giant smorgasbord of like world-changing things, or what's the shape?
It's actually a little less world-changing this week, I think. It's going to be a little less open source focused compared to last week. So yeah, we'll get to it in just a sec. But first, we also want to address these listener comments. We have a couple. Yes. So on Apple Podcast, Cool Dad had a nice review and mentioned, Jeremy, that we could upgrade our audio situation a bit, which we actually apparently have just done. Right?
Yes. Thank you, Cool Dad. So hopefully you're hearing me louder and clear this time. I checked the call settings on this thing. Apparently my default microphone, rather than my beautiful Scarlett Solo professional studio, whatever mic, was activated. So hopefully this is better. And yeah, we're doing what we can to put a smile on your faces.
Much better. We also have a review from meme.addict, another pretty great username, suggesting we use the term interesting less. Probably that's me. I like using interesting a lot. But yeah, I should try and switch up my terminology a little bit. And
I think
also
I'm very guilty of that too.
Yeah, there was also a comment on it being very difficult to add this review, and it is very annoying to review on Apple Podcast. So officially, if you want to give us a comment or a correction or a question, you can email contact@lastweekin.ai, or you can comment on our Substack in lastweekin.ai or YouTube. So those are probably easier ways than leaving reviews. Although we do like nice reviews as well. And one more, we will mention a review from Robo0890. Cool to hear. This is a high school student who is hoping to one day major in AI. And they asked if we could talk about AI as a career and what they should shoot for in college and beyond. So that's actually going to be our listener question for this week. And we're going to address it after we talk about all the news. Alrighty, and just to give a high-level overview, and we're going to jump in, this week is going to be pretty business-heavy. Lots of stories about companies, pretty dramatic story from Google with a leaked memo, supposedly. We also have a pretty large amount of research and policy and safety. And also even more stuff on music in the art section. So that's really been a big topic.
All right, so kicking things off with tools and apps, we have Microsoft 365's AI-powered Copilot is getting more features and paid access. This is a really kind of shockingly general purpose tool that Microsoft is developing and now starting to release incrementally. So essentially, this is like a thing that is a Copilot, not in the like GitHub code assistant sense, because that tool is called Copilot as well. But this is Microsoft Copilot, and it's like a Copilot for like all your Microsoft apps. So like, think PowerPoint, think Microsoft Designer, think Word, all that good stuff. Basically, you can go in and be like, yo, Copilot, I want you to like generate a March sales report. And the tool will be like, oh, okay, I know that sales reports are produced by Kelly on the finance team and created in Excel, and kind of like hook you up with that, basically. So this is a really, I don't want to call it like intrusive, but it's very kind of general purpose useful AI seeping into every kind of crevice of the day-to-day with Microsoft products. And yeah, a pretty big change, at least for those of us who are dinosaurs and grew up with like the old Microsoft Word where it was just humans typing stuff, a pretty big shift.
Definitely, yeah. And I think this approach from Microsoft is pretty smart, where it's kind of a branding thing almost, where we have GitHub Copilot, now you have Microsoft 365 Copilot. And yeah, it's all Copilots. They all kind of integrate with little assistant features. So for example, we've talked about Microsoft Designer last week, where it helps you design various things like Instagram posts. You can generate images in PowerPoint or flash out bullet points into whole paragraphs. Of course, in Word, you can auto-generate sentence completions and things like that. In Excel, I'm sure you can ask a natural language to do some stuff and it will figure out all the equations and so on to do that sort of thing. So there's a lot of pretty low-hanging fruit in all these products for what you can do. And I think probably they're going to be mostly free, or maybe there's going to be a subscription to get access to these features. That'll be interesting.
Yeah, I'm super curious about just the hallucination aspect of this. Like, you think about like what this means to be like, yo, Copilot, make me like the finance doc. Sorry, I'm not a finance person, obviously. Make me the finance doc for the month. And if this thing hallucinates, if it goes like, oh yeah, your revenues were this, and it makes up numbers. If you have inaccuracies at that level, this could potentially be fairly dangerous. So, high level of reliability is going to be required in these tools to use them for realsies. Obviously, human review is going to be an important thing to do, but kind of cool as we start to take our hands off the wheel here more and more with these systems. Where are we going to see them break? Where are we going to see hallucination be an issue, and so on?
Yeah. We just chatted about, from a UI perspective last week, how it's not obvious necessarily how we should integrate AI features into these existing, already powerful tools. And this will be not interesting. It'll be cool to see what Microsoft does with these copilots. So yeah, interesting. Not interesting.
Not interesting.
Not interesting. All right. Next up, we have Informatica goes all in on generative AI with Claire GPT. So actually, quite a similar story in a way. This Informatica is a provider of end-to-end data management solutions. So things like Excel, but also consuming, processing, managing, and analyzing data. And they're now planning to add this Claire GPT thing that is going to provide this natural language interface to do things like data discovery, data pipeline creation, metadata exploration, data quality and relationship exploration, all the stuff that you do with data as a big company, I assume. So yeah, another tool for businesses in this case.
Yeah, and to the comment that we got from Robo0890, that's so catchy, about AI careers, right? They mentioned here they're looking at realizing an up to 80% reduction in time spent on key data management tasks. So you think about the redefinition of what it means to be like a data engineer or a data cleaning person. This is changing the landscape of what's going to be expected, and probably moving people more towards like strategic functions in this space. But anyway, it's going to be really interesting to see what effects that has on the workforce. Like, how are jobs redefined? Because data engineer is not going to mean the same thing at many of these companies than it may have in the past.
Also, another thing to note from this article that I think is worth mentioning, like you mentioned, reliability and hallucination is very important to avoid with data that you're presumably using for some important stuff. So they go a little bit into how this is leveraging multi-LLM architecture, multiple large language models, where we use some public language models for things like ChatGPT, intent classification, but also fine-tuned Informatica hosted language models that generate data management artifacts. And the claim here is ChatGPT might be able to design a script and a data pipeline, and it will, but it might not work because of this stuff of hallucination and lack of governance. So if you want to talk about a moat and what is different here from just ChatGPT, I think in a specific niche, you actually do need to integrate it in some slightly more nuanced ways.
Yeah, and the multi-LLM thing, kind of self-correcting architectures, that sort of thing. I think that we're seeing a lot more products like that, where these language models have reached this critical threshold where they're actually able to offer input, in a sense, into each other's faults. So anyway, kind of cool to see that getting productized, if in fact that is what's going on here. I think that's what they're gesturing at when they say the multi-LLM strategy. Was that your read?
I think it's more like for specific functionalities and features, you will have multi-LLMs. So for some things like just asking questions or
I see.
figuring out what you want to do, that's something like ChatGPT, versus something that requires a very, very robust execution, like creating scripts for data pipelining, actual code, that might be actually created by Informatica and be more robust.
Okay, so they're like probably doing this with some kind of query routing model that like takes the initial user query and then goes like farms it out to a task specific model. That's the idea.
That's my impression. Yeah.
Okay, cool, cool.
Alrighty, next up, maybe a less impactful story. We have LinkedIn's new AI will write messages to hiring managers. So pretty much, what you can imagine from a story. If you want to message a hiring manager on LinkedIn, by the way, owned by Microsoft, uh, the AI will do it for you. It'll write a little like mini cover letter. It might include a few things from your profile as far as your experience, and you can avoid writing these initial like reaching out messages.
Yeah, I think this is actually like portending another really major shift in just the way everyday business is run. Sort of brief aside, I used to run a company whose whole thing was helping people get hired in data science. And so we talked a lot about outreach on LinkedIn and how much of a differentiator good writing is. And so here, when you start to automate that and you have like these really high quality messages, and that's what at least we're seeing here in this screenshot that we're looking at, like, this is no longer as much of a differentiator. And that used to be a kind of proof of work that you would do as a job seeker to show, hey, like I bothered to write a personalized message for you, and that would make you stand out. Once that stuff washes out, it's possible, like one direction this could go is like the value of LinkedIn as an outreach channel for people who are looking for work starts to drop as hiring managers just get spammed to blazes. So I don't know that that's how that's going to work out, but it's definitely one possibility that's raised by this thing.
Yeah, and I imagine, or I wonder if from the recruiter side, if you're getting messaged, do they get told by LinkedIn that this was AI generated, or do they kind of can't know? That's an interesting question. And you can get this by paying for LinkedIn Premium. So I don't know that too many people have access to this right now. But yeah, it's kind of, again, with Microsoft really moving fast to do all sorts of things with language models.
I like that dig at LinkedIn Premium too. Always nice to get one of those in.
Yeah, I don't imagine many listeners use that, but maybe I'm wrong. Then we move on to another story that doesn't involve language models, amazingly. We have Waymo One doubles service area in Phoenix and continues growing in San Francisco. So the story is, you can get it from the headline. Waymo now covers a lot of Phoenix, where they've actually launched, and anyone can use the service through an app to get basically a Lyft or Uber type thing, but with an autonomous car. They've been testing in kind of localized regions that are maybe easier, and now you can see the area almost doubled, and they serve a lot of rides. I think they mentioned here maybe thousands of riders per day. And similarly, in San Francisco, they are still expanding. They're more of a limited access. You have to apply to a wait list, but they're also pushing the ability to request rides there. You can already request rides 24/7. Yeah, I'm really impressed by Waymo and their progress. And I think, we are almost there with self-driving cars if they keep pushing it like this.
Yeah, I just all I know, and I really should know more about this. Like, which self-driving car companies are actually legitimately, truly on the road today with fully autonomous like self-driving cars? I know Waymo is like super committed to this. They're even making cars with like no steering wheel and the whole shebang. But like, yeah. Anyway, it's kind of, I was surprised to see that they were actually straight up doing it in two different cities and expanding in such a not aggressive way, but such a quick way. I'm kind of curious too, as we start to see these expansions happening in more and more unusual cities that look less and less like San Francisco, like how much are we going to start to see these like out of distribution errors popping up where you see robustness failures? Like for example, the car AI mistaking a snowbank for the sky or something, which was known to happen previously. Like, how are these the kinds of errors that we're going to see going to shift? I think that's going to be an interesting dimension to look out for, especially as the playbook evolves for launching in new cities. There's a lot here to learn about AI safety, and I think we're going to learn a lot about the safety and robustness of these systems going forward.
Definitely, yeah. Waymo One launched to the public back in 2020, actually, and they have since expanded to roughly 4 times the size of the initial service area. So I think that was their really pilot sort of city where they really kind of tried to figure out how you scale, how do you adapt to a new city. And I would say, as far as I know, in the US, only Waymo and Cruise are actually running fully autonomous cars that
Oh
anyone
yeah.
can use. And Waymo, to me, appears to be the leader in terms of the performance, reliability. They say that they are basically waiting for their final permit to offer paid rides in San Francisco.
Wow.
So, yeah, I think they are, finally self-driving cars are almost here. I think in hopefully within a year or two, they'll be in, major multiple cities, including LA, maybe even New York. I could see that happening, honestly, with Waymo.
And up next is applications in business. This is a big article that's been doing the rounds. This supposedly leaked Google memo from a Google insider, and it's called "We Have No Moat, and Neither Does OpenAI." Now, if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you know we've talked about moats a lot when it comes to scaled language models, scaled multimodal models. The question being like, can big companies continue to make cutting edge proprietary models that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to create and get value from those models? The risk is increasingly we're seeing things proliferate into the open source. Open source models are just getting so good, partly because once someone invests a ton of money into building a super powerful AI like GPT-4, you can take a much smaller model and like fine tune it on outputs that you collect from the bigger model, from GPT-4. So you can like get GPT-4 to basically create a custom training set for your smaller model, and then match the performance pretty closely of GPT-4 or similar models with some custom fine tuning, at least on specific tasks. So this is basically the premise here. This author is saying, like, look, in the wake of the leak of this highly scaled model from Meta that's called Llama that we've covered before, we have essentially a stable diffusion moment for large language models. And, stable diffusion is the open source alternative to DALL-E 2, and you don't tend to see people using DALL-E 2 quite so much these days. It's Midjourney and Stability AI are the two kind of front runners, or so it seems. And so, anyway, it kind of makes this argument that essentially there's all kinds of advantages, compounding advantages to open source. You can stack different fine tunings. So you can like fine tune your model for conversational dialogue. And then you can also fine tune it for instruction following. And that kind of stacks together nicely. So you have a model that can sort of do both at the same time. And that allows people to experiment very quickly in the open source, which makes it more difficult for like larger centralized companies to compete. A whole bunch of interesting arguments that we'll unpack here. But Andre, I just want to pivot to you here. Like, what were your thoughts when you first read this?
Yeah, I think this is definitely onto something. And I think we've already discussed it last week. We even mentioned, I think, this being kind of a stable diffusion moment. In the same vein, you get one powerful model, and from there, open source just goes crazy, develops a ton of tools, quickly iterates and improves upon it. And we've seen that in the past few weeks. So this memo really speaks to that. I don't know if I fully agree that there's no moat. There's, especially for OpenAI, GPT-4 appears to have a lot of tricks that they do that make it high quality, but also qualitatively different. Very large input window sizes, context sizes, and the speed is blazing fast, and even faster of Claude, where if you use one of these open source models, they are actually slower, even if they're smaller. So there are advantages that you have with OpenAI and these big companies. On the other hand, I also think that for many things, you don't need a super good model. You may not need a GPT-4 or a GPT-3, depending on the use case. And in many cases, I can imagine you need kind of a simpler model that is good for a single task. You begin with a general purpose language model or chatbot, and you make it specific to what you need, maybe like customer support or question answering about your particular app, etc. And for those things, I think this memo is spot on.
It totally is, right. Like last week we had not an entire episode on open source, but it was just like every other story. I will say, in agreement with what you just said, I mean, there are parts of this article that, this post that seem somewhat overstated. So one in particular, the author makes the claim that open source has like solved the scaling problem to the extent that anyone can tinker. And like, okay, but that's not the scaling problem, right? Like basically, if you want to make the most cutting edge AI models in the world, yes, there's just no other way besides pre-training with a disgusting amount of data and processing power. So that is still going to be the case. The open source models that we're seeing proliferate now, a lot of them follow that process that we just talked about of like, fine tuning a model on like data custom generated by, GPT-4 or ChatGPT. And that leads to models that can do specific tasks really well, but they can't, smash the performance of GPT-4 across a wide range of tasks typically. So usually what you find is people will say, oh, I matched GPT-4 in this like fairly narrow subset, this like subdomain. And then they'll say, okay, so therefore my system is GPT-4 level capability or whatever. And that we've seen that claim a couple times. I don't think we've explicitly flagged it when it's come up. Maybe we should have, but like, that I think is part of being a little bit more realistic about what can and can't be done today in open source. Not that these aren't very impressive and important capabilities, but it's not like GPT-4 is at risk of being fully open sourced quite yet.
Exactly. And I think the other thing worth noting is data, right? Where so far, yes, there are open data sets that can be used to train, but we've also been discussing how Reddit and Stack Overflow and other services that provide a lot of this data will probably start gatekeeping, and you have to pay large amounts of money to get access to their data. So for many commercial applications, I think the Moat will be just being able to have the data necessary and to specialize your model to whatever the context is. So Google, OpenAI, maybe they have no moat in the sense that they can't provide the best general purpose thing that hits everyone's needs, but individual companies and players in industry will have different types of moats depending on their niche.
And our next story here is, sorry, I have to do it this way. I just can't resist. AI will create a serious number of losers, DeepMind co-founder warns. So basically, it's just this. So it looks like from the title, it looks like this is going to be an article about just like, I don't know, the winners and losers in the space, or maybe job loss. It's actually sort of just a more general insider perspective on the whole AI landscape. And it's an interview with Mustafa Suleyman, who is one of the founders of Inflection AI and who's formerly of DeepMind. And he's talking about all kinds of things, including universal basic income, kind of flagging that this is something he thinks is going to be necessary. He also provides some, little interesting insider accounts of what it was like from, the view from within Google when ChatGPT was launched. And he's kind of like, look, with Lambda, as he says, we had ChatGPT a year and a half before ChatGPT. So Google was sitting on Lambda and hadn't launched it. And then out comes ChatGPT, basically because OpenAI is a very kind of very big on move fast and break things, like launch. And this is part of the race to the bottom dynamic that we've flagged before on the podcast. Like, OpenAI just decides to go ahead and launch this chatbot when potentially there were malicious use issues, there were all kinds of accident risks, that sort of thing. And Google is sitting there kind of patiently tinkering with Lambda, trying to make it safe and so on. Always unclear what the right call is in these situations, but it's an important and interesting, dare I say, dimension of this whole issue.
I think I would actually disagree a bit on that story framing. OpenAI was not that fast to break things. They had the GPT-3 playground for a while that was used by a much smaller number of people with basically the same freedom of ChatGPT. And they published the paper on reinforcement learning from human feedback back in March of 2023, and ChatGPT came out all the way after that in November. So I think they did spend a decent amount of time working on ChatGPT before release, and that was part of why it exploded. It was just good. It was reliable and it was performant. And Google had LaMDA. They had a chatbot that was qualitatively similar. Then I think Blake Lemoine having his whole sentient AI story really pushed them back into kind of going to hiding, and that might have been a real game changer. But yeah, this is a pretty good take from a very influential person, a DeepMind co-founder, right? DeepMind being a very influential firm doing a ton of publication and research. So it's probably worth reading if you are curious for these sorts of perspective.
Yeah, and good flag, by the way, on the ChatGPT fact check on me there. I think what I was thinking of in terms of quick releases, when they released ChatGPT with API, the ChatGPT API with tool use, I think that was one of those things where people said, whoa, like, hold on a minute. All of a sudden, we're now going to be able to like couple this to all kinds of things. But you're right. The actual like OpenAI with GPT-4 as well, we've seen them, take months and months before releasing something into the wild. So definitely shouldn't mean to imply that they're rushing to it. But anyway, race to the bottom is a thing, perhaps not in this particular issue.
And I think especially now with ChatGPT having exploded, because we often say this, OpenAI did not expect ChatGPT to be as big as it was. And I think a lot of us in AI kind of knew about language models and knew that they could do a ton of stuff that was really interesting. And it was just a matter of, I guess, getting to a point where the UI and services were there for anyone to try it. Next up, we have IBM takes another shot at Watson as AI boom picks up steam. So many of you may remember that IBM had this whole Watson thing with AI for maybe about a decade, where it was basically a suite of tools that offered different AI-powered things that kind of crashed and burned. It wasn't really good. I've heard some horror stories where it was basically underdeveloped and not very good, and it was kind of like a consulting thing more than anything. IBM sold its Watson Health unit, but now they're doing Watson X, which will be totally different, maybe. And this is a development studio for companies to train, tune, and deploy machine learning models. So actually totally different from what Watson was.
Yeah.
I guess they just want to keep a brand alive. And they'll include things like AI generated code, AI governance toolkit, and a library of thousands of large-scale AI models trained on language, geospatial data, code, and other things.
Yeah, it definitely feels like a pretty big philosophical pivot from IBM's kind of slowly dying consulting business model. Kind of cool to see them go more product centric, and I think it makes sense. They are partnering with Hugging Face to do this, which is kind of cool. And as well, like kind of probably a big win for Hugging Face too in terms of distribution. But yeah, I mean, I think this makes sense. It's so hard to know. IBM is like such a difficult company to assess because they do have that reach, even though they're kind of like old school, in terms of their a lot of their models and practices. That distribution, like, you should not underestimate it. We saw Microsoft Teams like just absolutely kick Slack's ass when it first launched for distribution reasons as well. So, who knows? Maybe just coupling it to a platform like this, breathes new life into the whole business.
Yeah, and we've been discussing a lot of these B2C things, so businesses that aim at consumers with things like Microsoft 365 or various tools you can use for your own purposes. But this is more B2B, targeting enterprise customers. That's where you can make a lot of money, and that's where IBM is more experienced. Another story related to this, also about IBM, came out. It's IBM to pause hiring for jobs that AI could do. So the CEO of IBM actually said this recently, that they will pause hiring for roles that could be replaced through AI. And that could be 30% of their global workforce that is non-customer facing. So that's about 26,000 jobs they might pause hiring on, which is a pretty dramatic statement to make.
Yeah, and if you think back to maybe last episode or the episode before when we were talking about one of these generic Gartner type reports where people are like AI will create 7% increase in GDP over the next however many years. When you look at like a company, if assuming this isn't completely off base, the 30% figure in practice, like this is pretty significant in terms of the efficiency gains and the GDP implications. So I don't know. I'm just going to chalk this one up as another data point in favor of our shared thesis from a couple episodes ago that the changes, they might be a fair bit bigger than the consultants at Gardner or whatever might think.
Well, I will say I think it's a little more complicated. GDP is gross domestic product. So the question is, are we going to see a lot of jobs be augmented and basically disappear and replaced with AI, in which case the total output stays the same, it just have fewer people doing it? Or do we see a lot more be created and sold and so on because we have AI and we can do more? That's kind of a balance that is not too clear right now.
I'm sort of more seeing it as like we have now reached a threshold of AI capability where this much value can be unlocked in automated form. So, once you can do that in one domain, I suspect that like a much broader industry transformation is afoot. Obviously, no way to know. And these numbers too, like these numbers tend to not pan out. Big numbers like 30% probably, that target, may not materialize. But just to be at this stage where we're contemplating that being an option, feels like it might be indicative of something.
Definitely. And onto a quite different sector, we have a story. Peter Thiel's Palantir is seeing unprecedented demand for its military AI that its CEO calls a weapon that will allow you to win. So, pretty dramatic story. The shares of Palantir were up as much as 21% when they previewed the artificial intelligence platform, a tool that can be used by militaries to use ChatGPT type tools for battlefield intelligence and decision making. There was a demo video where they showed that you can do a lot of things like monitoring activity, receiving alerts, and then asking the chatbot for more details and asking the AI to guess what the information may mean, and so on. You can pretty much use a chatbot to analyze the data and then make decisions and send out commands essentially to military divisions. So yeah, this is it's a pretty big tool.
Yeah, and what a challenge too for test and evaluation, right? I mean, this is a high stakes application of AI. The U.S. DoD has a famous directive 3000.08 that, anyways, that's more about automated weapon systems. But they've got a culture and tradition of test and evaluation with AI systems, and generally like eagerness to adopt, but skepticism about adopting them quickly. And so they're going to have their hands full. I mean, I'm guessing that they have already explored this tool a lot for this to be happening. But I'd be really curious, like, how is this thing tested? Like, how can you get assurances that the battlefield decision making that you're going to be doing with this tool is actually going to be safe and reliable and robust and transparent and all those good things? Because this is a very significant thing to be doing, automating a lot of battlefield activities.
Definitely. And related to that, there was a second story from Vice, I think is worth reading, that covers a bit more detail on the demo. It's titled Palantir Demos AI to Fight Wars, but says it will be totally ethical. Don't worry about it. So it walks through the demo, includes a video in there, which really showcases what it is, and includes all these steps of essentially seeing a scenario, getting information, telling the AI to get better photos, and it launches a drone to take photos, asking what to do about the tank that the drone has seen, and then the AI generates 3 parsable courses of action, and then you can send that off a chain of command. Yeah, it's really kind of just streamlining what probably people would be doing anyway in this military process, is just making it much quicker and including things like ChatGPT for clarifying information. And so because it's all human in the loop, it might be a little less scary than if AI were just making autonomous decisions and controlling army resources. But still, you can imagine it making mistakes and misclassifying things and maybe suggesting the wrong course of action, and that resulting in some truly catastrophic outcomes.
Yeah, which is where it's so interesting, where specifically the human shows up in the loop. Like they've got humans making the decision, okay, to send the drones, choosing between different strategies, things like that. So yeah, what are the consistent choke points where human interjection is going to be maintained? I think that's a really interesting question of establishing not just norms for the US military, but international norms around where human intervention is maintained in this whole structure. So anyway, I think these are really important precedent-setting activities, and it's a space to follow for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Next up, we have Chegg CEO calls 48% stock plunge over ChatGPT fears, quotes, extraordinarily overblown. And so this follows a story that I think we covered. I can't remember if it was last week.
We mentioned it last week. We didn't cover it.
We mentioned it. Okay, that's what. Okay, I think I read it and I was going to cover it, but then So essentially, the Chegg came out. Chegg is this big ed tech company, and they came out and said, "Look, we're getting our clocks cleaned here by ChatGPT. Presumably, students using ChatGPT maybe rather than Chegg products, that sort of thing. And as a result, Chegg's market share just plunged. Sorry, not their market share. Their market cap plunged. 48% stock price decrease on Tuesday, which was." Now the CEO, Dan Rosenweg, is coming out and saying this is like totally overblown. And then the shares went back up by 8%. So a lot of good that must do. We're now back up to just 40% down on net. But I think just another indication of how dramatic the impact of ChatGPT even now is. And Chegg is trying to get ahead of this, launching their own GPT-4 powered AI platform called Cheggmate. So I guess, if you can't beat them, join them type thing. But really interesting to see this. I think we're going to see a lot of companies, I don't know if you can call it a flail, but it's certainly a lot, reassessing their strategic outlook and trying to be as AI savvy as they possibly can in light of all the capabilities coming on the market. It seems like all at once.
Definitely. And actually, in case it's not clear, Chegg, their whole business is helping students prepare for exams and do homework. So that's why there's all of this kind of concern that you can prepare your homework and study with ChatGPT, and it's quite good. Chegg's whole argument is, well, yes, but you may not always rely on ChatGPT being correct. It makes things up sometimes. So hopefully its own GPT-4, Cheggmate, can then be fine-tuned and more specialized in having accurate answers. May or may not be a true hypothesis. I'm pretty skeptical, and it seems like the stock price really reflects that. Back to Microsoft. Another story is Microsoft working with AMD on expansion into processors. Last week, we talked about how Microsoft is working on the Athena chip to try and have its own chip to compete or just not rely on NVIDIA. And this week, we are hearing that they are working with AMD, a competitor to NVIDIA, to work on another chip. Basically, it's a multi-pronged strategy to develop different options. So the shares of AMD jumped by more than 6.5%. Microsoft jumped 1%. NVIDIA stock declined by 2%. So yeah, kind of a big deal.
Yeah, also kind of an interesting indication of the zero-sum nature of the competition here that some people are seeing between presumably this Microsoft AMD collab and then like NVIDIA. So interesting to see the anti-correlation of those stocks. One of the interesting things too noted here is that Microsoft has actually spent about $2 billion on its chip efforts, which sounds like a lot of money, but then and again, I don't remember if this was last episode that I mentioned this, but apparently Facebook in their latest earnings call spent $30 billion, $30 billion roughly, training their AI models. So when you think about just the scale of money that's being invested in training budgets, a $2 billion budget for chip efforts, it's big, but certainly within reason.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that relatively small number to reflect that this has been a growing project within Microsoft. So they have been growing the Silicon division under former Intel executive Ronnie Borkar, and that group now has a staff of almost 1,000 employees. So they are, I think, have spent $2 billion so far, but that number is going to be way bigger this year, and they are going to invest way more. It seems.
That's one of the things, with like hardware. It's actually really hard to spend a lot of money on hardware development. Like, it doesn't scale super fast, and you kind of got to do this in a very layered way, both for talent and actual hardware purposes. So yeah, no, kind of cool to see the effort grow.
Next story, generative AI startup Runway just raised $100 million at a $1.5 billion valuation from a cloud service provider. So we've mentioned Runway a couple of times before. They do AI for video editing, broadly speaking, and they raised a new funding round of at least $100 million that triples the startup's valuation to $1.5 billion. Apparently, this is from a cloud service provider. The article did not mention which one, but that could be AWS, that could be Google Cloud. And this is kind of unusual. Usually you would get money from a venture capital firm, but in this case, it's from a cloud provider, which makes a lot of sense for an AI company specifically because they might be using that cloud compute.
Yeah, and it's really consistent, right, with the broader trends that we've seen. Like, it kind of seems like so you've got the cloud providers and then you've got the model developers, and there's sort of like this natural symbiosis that's been happening lately between those two, where a model developer is always going to be in search of a cloud provider at scale to partner with it. We saw this with Anthropic partnering with Google through like $100 million investments. We've seen this with OpenAI and Microsoft. We've seen this with Cohere and Google. We're seeing it over and over and over again. So it kind of seems like this natural pairing, and very, very interesting. Or it's going to be very interesting to see who retains the leverage in that relationship as time goes on. Like, do we see the model developers? This is a question of where the moats are, right? And where the value capture can happen in this ecosystem. So that story is left untold right now. A lot of this is speculation about where the value will be hiding. But yeah, that pairing of cloud provider and model developer very much now being it starts to look like a very consistent trend here.
Exactly. And to your point, I think the moat will become much more about infrastructure than model development, which is still a major kind of component. You are not going to scale up to the level of Google or Microsoft, Azure, or AWS as a small startup. There's just no way to get into that space. And speaking of Google, last story in business, top ex-Google AI researchers raise funding from Thrive Capital. So two prominent former Google AI researchers, Ashish Vaswani and Nikki Parmar, are now creating Essential AI, and they are pretty big as far as researchers go. They co-wrote or were a couple of the authors on the 2017 paper Attention is All You Need, which introduced the transformer neural net architecture, which powers ChatGPT and kind of everything related to language models these days, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So they're pretty big names because of the impact of that one paper, essentially. And yeah, as a result, I assume they can get money pretty easily.
Yeah, the couple of interesting notes about this one, sort of insider baseball in Silicon Valley, I guess. So Nikki Parmar, you mentioned Andre, her contribution in the transformer space. She actually was one of the co-founders of Adept AI, which I don't think we've talked too much about on the podcast, but like basically this is a company that wants to build an AI where you can type in like, hey, book me a hotel, and it just goes out and does that for any variety of different activities, sort of like transformers that take actions on the internet. What's really interesting here is she is presumably leaving Adept AI to start this new company. I think Adept, at last I was aware, had raised like, I think initially it was $65 million Series A and then a few $100 million more. Oh yeah, it says, is it 415 million? Yeah, that's it. Right. Yeah. So it looks like they've raised over $400 million. So one of the questions that always comes to mind, if you have a startup like this that doesn't have a clear partnership with a cloud service provider, just like we've talked about, is like how much are they going to actually be able to hum along with the outrageous compute budgets required by cutting edge transformers, or just cutting edge scaled models more generally. So sort of interesting to see that departure from Adept. I think that's a notable thing. I don't know whether to read too much into that about the state of things over at Adept, but definitely something that I took to be somewhat surprising.
Yeah, I think it's kind of unusual, but at the same time, I don't think we should kind of speculate too much. I found it kind of cool that the article covered how these couple of offers are just among a group really of the authors of this paper who have left Google and started companies. So the startup Character.ai and the startup Cohere are both also started by former co-authors, and those are huge and very influential. So that is kind of a good story. There should be like a little book on this paper and everything that came after it, maybe.
Yeah, the attention is all you need, Mafia.
Yeah. Also, I just noticed we mentioned no priors. We sold out earlier. And one
there
of
he
the
is.
angel investors, Elliot Gill, is a co-host of that. So that tells you something, I guess.
All right, and kicking off projects and open source here, some really interesting stories. The first one is Meta open source's multisensory AI model that combines 6 types of data. So this is an open sourced super multimodal model. It's called ImageBind. It links together a whole bunch of different kinds of data, including text, audio, visual data, temperature, and movement readings. And it's kind of cool because, we've seen a lot of image, audio, text models sometimes mixed together. Temperature, kind of infrared data and movement are a bit rare. So sort of cool to see these combined together. But it is consistent with what we know of Meta's philosophy, and specifically the philosophy of Yann LeCun, who runs AI over at Meta, who kind of views the path towards human-level AI, or AGI, as being replicating the structure, at least the behavior, of the human brain. And the human brain intrinsically is multimodal, right? We experience the world through auditory, visual, all kinds of sensory stuff. And so this is really a reflection of that philosophy. It's consistent with other things that we've seen Meta do, like data to vec a few years ago. And fundamentally, it's about grounding, like getting multiple different kinds of data to all kind of not collaborate with each other, but to all kind of, mutually back each other up and create agents, or systems rather, that can perceive their surroundings in very rich ways.
Yeah, this is probably the biggest story of open source and maybe in AI progress really this week. Another example of Meta really being keen on open sourcing a lot of stuff, and another example of them still being really at the forefront of a lot of research. So this is a pretty big deal in terms of if you can embed images and audio and other things into the same space, there's a lot of things you can build that rely on multiple modalities, which is still a pretty challenging problem. And they use a pretty novel idea here of basically, like the title says, image bind. They are binding or including pairs of image plus X, image plus depth, image plus audio. And by training on all of these pairs, at the end, you have an embedding space for 6 different modalities. It's actually not unusual in computer vision research to do things like image and depth and IR training that is sort of multimodal, but here depth with text, with audio, with IMU, with heat map is pretty, hasn't been done before, and is really big for things like self-driving cars and anything that actually happens in the real world, where language models are not so equipped. Here, I think that is definitely a better fit.
Yeah, and from a robustness standpoint, that kind of multimodality, really important. You can think about LiDAR plus visual plus IR plus all these different things. So yeah, and this really is the first multimodal model that is this multimodal that's come out in open source generally too. So like you said, a pretty big watershed moment in general for this open source movement.
Indeed. And then moving down to a pretty small project, not by company, we have no cloud required. Chatbot runs locally on iPhones and old PCs. So this is an open source project called MLC LLM. MLC is machine learning compilation that allows developers to slim down models and make it easy to process. This is a group of researchers who go by MLC AI that also allow you to run large language models in a web browser through a different project. We've mentioned Vicuna a couple times. That's a language model that is fairly small, 7 billion models, was just released a month ago and is pretty good. It's not ChatGPT level, but maybe 80% or 90%, surprisingly good for being so much smaller. And yeah, they've released the ability to put it on your iPhone, not just use it from your iPhone. It actually runs locally on your iPhone or PC or Mac or etc. It may not work on older iPhones with less memory. It does mention in this article that you need maybe 6 gigabytes of RAM, but still pretty impressive.
Yeah, and it continues a bunch of different trends that we've tracked in different episodes in open source, one of which is, yes, the use of Llama and Llama descended models like Vicuna. They're coming up an awful lot. The compression of models to be able to fit on edge devices. So this is obviously at the focus here. And then also at a meta level, the creation of frameworks that allow for more efficient future development in open source as open source kind of starts to eat itself or build off itself. So there's a lot going on here that kind of merges these different trends in one place. And I don't think that's a coincidence. We're seeing this acceleration in open source for a reason, all these different frameworks and capabilities anyway, coming online all at the same time.
Yeah, and again, just crazy how things are moving. We just saw Vicuna released a month ago.
Yeah.
Now you can run it on your phone.
That's funny. You take that for granted, like especially like on this show, we've talked about it 3 times, so it feels like old news. But like that means 3 weeks have gone by.
Yeah. Last story in open source: Hugging Face and ServiceNow release a free code generating model. So last week we talked about Replete releasing a code generating model that was similar to GitHub's Copilot. This week we have Hugging Face and ServiceNow releasing it. So they fully open sourced it. They have a very permissive license where you can use it for whatever you want with royalty-free generation. It was trained on over 80 programming languages and text from GitHub, including documentation. It integrates with Microsoft's Visual Studio Code, just like Copilot. So yeah, it looks like a serious competitor to GitHub Copilot to me.
Yeah, and this thing is no joke. I mean, they say Hugging Face supplied an in-house compute cluster of 512 NVIDIA V100 GPUs. So, that's a decent amount of processing power. Like that's no joke. That's no small open source piddling little project.
15 billion parameters.
Right. Like it's, I'm impressed. I would not have expected, such a powerful version of this to be open sourced. It really does make you wonder, like, okay, what about moats? For codecs and similar models. Though I do suspect ultimately the moat there is going to come from the base model just being more scaled and the context window being longer. I think that actually makes such a big difference for software. When the context window is long enough to like capture an entire code base, like the amount of shit you could do with that is like probably pretty staggering. So this is a really big move in open source. I'm very curious to see how it interacts with the proprietary kind of competitors that it's up against. But wow, I mean, big budgets being spent.
Yeah, if you don't want to pay for GitHub Copilot, which it's a little pricey,
like
$10
is it $20 a month now?
I think 10. It's maybe 10, yeah, but still, you can maybe give this a try.
All right, and now research and advancements. We're opening with Meet LLAva. Again, another one of these fun, let's come up with a convoluted name for our new language model.
We had Lamini now. We have now Lava.
Oh my God, yeah. It's just like, this is out of control, everybody. We got to calm down. Meet LLAva, a large language multimodal model and visualization assistant that connects a vision encoder and Vicuna for general purpose visual and language understanding visual instruction training. So bold move, putting the entire paper in the title. I really respect that. But what's going on here is they're taking a clip. So just by way of background, a million years ago, shortly after GPT-3 was released, or actually a couple months after, OpenAI also released this system called Clip. Clip basically is an all-purpose image classifier. Basically, you feed it an image, and it will, give you classify it according to what it can.
It matches text with images, so it tells you, is this text the same as this image, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like a captioning tool, essentially. And so what they're doing is they're using the clip encoder and they're hooking that up to Vicuna. Oh, there it is again, which is this conversation-tuned language model, and basically smushing them together to create a multimodal model that they're trying to use to kind of instruction tune a multimodal model. So instruction tuning is when you train this model to take in some instruction and then execute on that instruction. And in this case, they want a multimodal instruction tune model that can take in an image and text. So for example, the text might be describe to me what's in this image, or count how many balls there are in this image, something like that. And you want to feed that to your model and then get its output. So this is the first time we've seen an open source model like this that is multimodal and instruction tuned, which is kind of cool. And it apparently exhibits a lot of the same capability as, again, a lot of the same capability as GPT-4. 85.1% relative score compared to GPT-4 on a synthetic multimodal instruction following data set. So that is a narrow test. That's not generally as good as GPT-4, 85% is good. But certainly on this particular task and on a couple others, it achieves some really impressive performance, including state-of-the-art accuracy on Science QA once it was fine-tuned on it. So pretty impressive, and another, I think, big moment for academia and research being able to access powerful multimodal models.
Yeah, if you go to their website, they have a little project website. You can probably Google visual instruction tuning or Lava, large language and vision assistant, and they have just an embedded demo. You can use it directly. And the paper is quite fun to read. As usual, they include some examples. So they have an example of, I guess, a man attached to the back of a taxi cab ironing his clothes. And then they asked, what is unusual in this image, or what is happening in this scene? And they show that GPT-4 is not great. It says that this is a man ironing clothes on an ironing board attached to the roof of a moving taxi. Here, Lava produces much more accurate and much more detailed images. And you can use it to explain memes too, which is
if you're ever confused by one.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, next step is creating memes that are good.
That image of the guy on the back of the car with with the table or whatever, that's something I've seen used in basically every paper that does multimodal question answering. For some reason, they'll ask it what's funny about this image or what's unusual about this image. Kind of anyway, I guess a meme.
Yeah, and the fact this is also open sourced. You have the data, the code base, and the model code all out there, adds on to what we've been saying of how quickly everything is coming together.
Does it ever get tiring being yep, and then now another open source breakthrough?
Yeah, maybe we should just stop saying it interesting, just open source, done.
So next up, we have language models can explain neurons in language models. And this is a blog post and a research paper and code and all that good stuff coming out from OpenAI. It's kind of unclear how big of a deal this is. I think conceptually it's a big deal. The question is, like, have they actually achieved something significant in this specific instance with this technique? But basically, just to lay a bit of background here, one of the key questions that OpenAI is grappling with as they work toward building more and more powerful AI systems is, would you be able to detect misalignment? Would you be able to detect if an AI system is making plans that are potentially dangerous, potentially adversarial, if there's inner alignment failure, power seeking, all the things that the alignment team at OpenAI and elsewhere worry about? And so being able to interpret the functioning of a language model is really important through that lens. Like, can we look at the neurons in a model, like in this case, GPT-2, and assign a meaning, like a plain English meaning to each neuron? Say, like, okay, this neuron is kind of looking for things like this. And there are a bunch of mechanistic interpretability strategies that are manual and that people like Chris Olah pioneered that allow you to kind of like, crack open neural networks and look at what a specific neuron is doing by feeding a bunch of different inputs usually and seeing, correlating those inputs to the activity of the neuron. This is a little bit different. So here they're going to use GPT-4 to basically, they give GPT-4 a neuron in GPT-2, and they ask it to generate an explanation for its behavior by basically feeding in a bunch of relevant text sequences and looking at the activations associated with that neuron. And then they get GPT-4 to actually try to simulate what a neuron that fired would, like, how that neuron would fire according to an explanation that it generates. So it kind of guesses, okay, I think this neuron is firing with, for, I don't know, possessives or words that end in S or something like that. Then it'll go, okay, now feed it a new sentence. And based on the explanation that you've just come up with, that this neuron fires when it sees S's, what do you think is going to cause that neuron to fire in this sentence? And presumably it would predict that words that end in S's in that new sentence would cause that neuron to fire. So it would predict that neuron's firing patterns accordingly. And then you compare the actual firing patterns of the neuron with the predicted ones that you get from GPT-4, and that score is what you end up optimizing. So I hope that's not too over-the-top complicated, but essentially this is a scheme that allows you to automate the generation of plain English explanations for what individual neurons in the structure are doing.
Yeah, I would say I wouldn't. In my view, this doesn't seem like a huge deal. First of all, it's not very surprising. Basically, what you're doing here is we already know you can look at the sort of attention of a given neuron, what it is focusing on in a given input. So as one concrete example, right, you can have a neuron that focuses on fractions, and you can see in a given paragraph that it basically works on the fraction component. And the way this works is very straightforward. You just say to GPT-4, okay, here's GPT-2, a smaller language model. Here is where it focuses when it is attending to this input. Based on the things that it is focusing on, what do you guess kind of its general focuses outside of this one example? And it's not surprising that this works. You can do this as a human pretty easily, and this is just automating that process. I guess there are a lot of interesting findings aside from the specific technique. So if you go to a website, it's kind of fun to browse. You can read the paper, you can view neurons, so you can see concrete examples of the neurons they find. So they find neurons like Canada, fractions, citations, certainty, doing things right, lots of these examples. Now, the other question is, how is this actually useful beyond explainability? There's an argument to be made that you could find bad neurons that do things you don't want. Maybe you can edit out certain knowledge or certain ideas within a language model. But at the same time, this is very expensive because you need to run this, like, you have a 7 billion parameter model. That means you have 7 billion neurons, and you need to individually get the outputs or get GPT-4 to look at the outputs of one of those and kind of skim through and see if you can find anything. So for very large language models, this might not be scalable. So some caveats on the impacts of this and sort of the significance, but still, it is very cool, and it is a pretty different approach from what we've seen, even if it is pretty, I don't know, logical in terms of how it is implemented.
Yeah, and I think this sort of strategic significance of this from the standpoint of OpenAI's alignment agenda is that they plan on using AI to help them align AI. And the advantage of the scheme is it does seem like a potentially scalable way to do that, albeit with massive compute costs. And I think they're going to have to figure out how to deal with that, because like this is GPT-2, right? It's not like they're looking at even GPT-3 or GPT-4. So even with this relatively small and simple system with a few 100,000 neurons, like that's a lot of compute. And anyway, it's also unclear whether you can actually successfully use a smaller system to interpret a bigger one, because that's going to be a deeper question. Like presumably you want to use this for safety, so you want to use a model you know is trustworthy and reliable, a smaller model that you've actually audited, to check a larger model. And it's unclear whether that's actually going to extend. There are all kinds of questions here about like, okay, you can look at individual neurons, but what about circuits of neurons? And that's its own further challenge. So a lot of interesting possible avenues for improving this and pushing it further. But for the moment, yeah, I agree. I think this is like, it's a beachhead. It's a first step. And let's just see where it goes from here.
Yeah, and kudos to OpenAI for publishing the paper and the code and data set, not doing a publication in a conference with peer review, but arguably that's a broken process. So congrats or cheers on still doing research on top of making money. All right, next very impressive story. AI is getting better at mind reading from New York Times. So we've seen before how if you implant something in the brain and do scans, you can actually basically read through what people are thinking in some sense. And this is a next step on that, where now you don't have to implant anything. You can just use fMRI scans, which measure the flow of blood to different regions of the brain, and you can decode kind of what words and sentences people are imagining. So for instance, there's an example where a person was thinking, I got up from the air mattress and pressed my face against the glass of a bedroom window, and then decoded from verbatim activity. I can just continue to walk up to a window and open the glass. I stood up on my toes and peered out. So it's not the same, but it gets kind of a general gist of what's happening and the message. Another example is, look for a message from my wife saying that she had changed her mind and that she was coming back. The decoded version is, to see her for some reason, I thought she would come to me and say she misses me. And these are pre-written kind of things like that. So yeah, pretty
no
fun.
ethical issues whatsoever there. Yeah, and it's also consistent with other research we've seen doing this in the optical domain, where people kind of reconstruct what patients are seeing. So we're definitely sort of approaching the human senses from different angles. One of the little notes that I thought was interesting here is that training the model takes long. But to be effective, this must be done on individuals. So maybe not too surprising, of course, but it does mean that variation, presumably, between individual brains and the way individuals process information is still relevant here. It's not like there's a one-size-fits-all thing that, one model that can reconstruct all this for everybody.
Yeah, so pretty limited. The fMRI machines are also big and bulky, and they are using language models as a sort of method to decode things. So those are expensive to compute. Don't worry about any sort of mind reading implants or hats anytime soon, but could definitely be useful for, let's say, paralyzed people or applications like that. Next, on more of a science front, we have a story: AI could run 1 million microbial experiments per year. This was just published in Nature Microbiology. And yeah, the story is that they found that you can get autonomous scientific experiments run by AI up to 10,000 per day. And with this, you can collect a data set. So they have an AI platform called Bacter AI that once you collect a bunch of data from these autonomous experiments, you can train a model to predict things about AI. So basically, they're things about bacteria. They predict what sorts of food, what sorts of combinations of amino acids you can use to support the life of certain bacteria. So you can really move much faster to understand a lot of bacteria with AI.
Yeah, one dimension that's really exciting about this sort of thing too is just replicability, because obviously there are major issues, especially in biology, around replicability of results in science. So if you can automate it and have a very clearly auditable process for your data collection, hey, maybe that leads to more robust results. So it could be a cool implication of this.
Exactly. Yeah, this is a method for data generation and then using the data to train a model. So you can publish the data to other scientists. And let's go to robotics for a couple of stories, just fun. First, we have scurrying centipedes inspire many-legged robots that can traverse difficult landscapes. So usually we think of robots as these wheeled agents or maybe humanoids. Here we have kind of centipede-looking robots that have many legs that are pretty decently sized. So you can actually see images from the story from Tech. And they're good in the sense that they can move over rough terrain and sort of tricky areas where humanoids or driven robots may struggle.
Yeah, and they've mentioned that they actually developed a new theory of multi-legged locomotion for this, which is sort of interesting. Like, I didn't know that that was the process for building systems like this. Like, first, I guess you need some sort of, I don't know if it's like a control theory or whatever it would be, but like it seemed to work. So some human kind of handcrafted equationeering went on in the background here before unleashing the models.
Yeah, and this is kind of related to a general movement. There's a whole soft robotics field where they look at different kind of bodied robots that can move via inflation or kind of general like animal type things that aren't necessarily mammals. And this is another example where you could use this for things like search and rescue or in agriculture where other robot bodies may not be as suitable. One more robotic story: little robots learn to drive fast in the real world. So from Berkeley, we have a little story on basically our C cars, you can imagine, and how they found a way to get them to train really fast in the real world. So instead of what we mostly see with language models, just training on the internet, here the robots actually need to drive around and, fail and succeed. That's really expensive. And they have a technique here that does some pre-training offline with a collected data set from humans, and then it's really fast to train by trial and error.
Again, that division between pre-training and like kind of not online learning, but actually kind of here, sort of interesting to see that continually coming up as this very clear separation. We see it with language models and cool to see it extend into RL, though that's been a thing for a while now.
Yeah, we don't discuss reinforcement learning that much in this podcast just because it doesn't make the news as much, but there's still a lot of research on it. And I think in the long term, we'll see a lot of it in these chatbot systems.
Yeah, progress in that field has been steady. Like that's one of the things kind of in the background. You do see breakthroughs and people kind of, creating more and more efficient systems. I'm really curious, like at what point are we going to see like maybe cross a compute threshold and maybe RL becomes competitive or something like that? I'm really curious about where that ends up going.
Indeed. I found it kind of funny. This article actually made a little mistake. This is from IEEE Spectrum, and they said that this leverages a foundation model which is a term to describe things like GPT-3 and GPT-4. Not what this is doing. This is using a model as a foundation. So that was a bit amusing.
Of course, the Stanford guy has an issue with the use of foundation model.
Yeah.
Sorry, inside baseball, Stanford is where the term foundation model was coined. That's what I was getting at.
Yeah, just kind of funny if you're in AI, this would be. I was kind of confused. Are they using like GPT-4 for driving?
It almost feels like it could, right? Because like you could use that as anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. And just one last story for robotics. I think this one is kind of cute, so it'd be fun to highlight. Latest pitch for AI, DeepMind-trained soccer robots. So if you imagine little tiny humanoids, I don't know, maybe like a foot in size, running around a little soccer field, hitting a ball, this is exactly what this is. And this is very tricky from a learning perspective. This is also doing deep RL with trial and error. And there's this whole paper describing how you can train the robots via trial and error and splitting up into multiple steps. And in the end, you have a video where these two robots actually sort of play soccer. They can hit the ball, block, they can recover from falling, all sorts of stuff. And even though it just looks cute, it's also pretty impressive.
Yeah. I mean, soccer has kind of become, it seems like it's become the new walking. You know how like for a while, the big challenge was, can we get like a bipedal robot to blah, blah, blah. And for some reason, there seems to be some convergence around this task. Kind of interesting to see.
Yeah, and it actually harkens back. There is a thing called RoboCup, which is a competition of robot soccer, basically. And colleges and I think high schools maybe, but definitely colleges create programs to compete with their own, software in soccer. So related to that, different kind of robot and more research. But yeah, robot soccer, it's going to be a thing.
All right, so kicking off policy and safety now. So we have China's AI industry barely slowed by US chip export rules. And so this is about a set of export controls the US government put in place in different tranches and different layers over the last couple of years. So we have right now these restrictions that are imposed on, among other companies, NVIDIA, and they're not allowed to sell their cutting edge Hopper GPUs to China just as is. So the GPUs that NVIDIA sells, the H100s that they sell in the US, are different from the H800s that are being sold in China. The Chinese versions have been downgraded in some very specific ways that were hypothesized to slow down Chinese development of cutting-edge language models. So in particular, the kind of the ability to transfer data between chips at high speed, that's been capped. And that's a really interesting dimension of this because it dates back to a time where people thought that AI scaling would involve very rapid growth in model sizes, which would mean that you would have to store your models on a lot of different GPUs, a lot of different chips. And in that context, chip-to-chip transfer speed actually becomes really important. It becomes a key bottleneck. But now that we're seeing a little bit of consolidation around, not quite so big models, the argument here in part is that the effect of these measures has been blunted. It hasn't actually slowed down progress in China quite so much. It seems like the net cost here is to make training about 50%, about twice as expensive, let's say, 100% more expensive in China. And as they write in the article, that's a big cost, but not necessarily a giant deal for, the tech giants like Baidu and Alibaba that have really, really big budgets for model training. So interesting to see the export control game kind of starting to get fine-tuned, some of the holes being exposed through articles like this one.
Yeah. So far, the impact may not be huge. The fact that this is like 10 to 30% longer to carry out some tasks is not a ton, and doubling costs, that's a lot, but these giant companies can handle it. The question is, as we keep going, and if we do keep seeing larger and larger models, if the restrictions are the same, is it going to be much more painful as China is sort of stuck with these smaller compute capabilities? a very dramatic move from the US to actually put down this restriction last year, and very combative.
Right. Yeah. And their philosophy here being of like degrading, but not cutting off at the knees China's ecosystem here. Like the goal is, okay, give them kind of a safety net for the moment. It seems like this isn't a crippling blow, but over time, the hope is that as chip technology gets better and better, the gap between the West and China is going to start to grow between Western processors, Western chips rather, and Chinese ones. So sort of interesting to see how they've decided to split the baby here, and we'll see if it ends up actually being effective.
Yeah, it's surprising. I feel like we haven't seen that much dialogue on this whole AI race angle that we cover from time to time with ChatGPT, etc. We haven't seen many stories saying, "Oh, is China going to catch up?" or whatever. But once Baidu and Tencent and whoever else starts releasing their ChatGPT equivalents, maybe that will be a bigger consideration for the US.
Yeah, well, and we've seen that right with Baidu. They launched their own sort of ChatGPT thing based on Ernie a few weeks ago, and its performance is considered like pretty good. So it seems for the moment that if they're not holding their own, they're at least in the arena. But again, over time, as the gap starts to grow, maybe that starts to change, and we start to see some more noticeable delta there. All right, and next up we have Anthropic thinks constitutional AI is the best way to train models. And related to this, they also recently came out and shared the constitution that their constitutional AI scheme uses. So just as a primer, by way of background, constitutional AI is Anthropic's own kind of special secret sauce that they created. It's designed to be a strategy to better align large language models. And the way it works is you have a language model that generates some kind of output, and maybe that output is flawed. Maybe that output, tells somebody how to make a bomb or something. So then you get another language model, or potentially the same model, depending on the scheme, and have that model evaluate that output from the first model according to some constitution. And that constitution might contain, terminology like, make sure the output is benign, benevolent, honest, trustworthy, and so on. And so it evaluates the output of the first model, and then it writes a kind of corrected version of that output that is consistent with the Constitution. And then the first model gets retrained on the corrected output. So you kind of have this loop where AI is sort of self-correcting during the training process, and baking in these ethical, constitutional principles into the training process itself. So different from reinforcement learning from human feedback, which, number one, requires actual human feedback. This is a totally automated process, and it's based on this constitution that the AI uses to self-critique. And it's done during training as this, instead of like just after, as part of fine tuning. So in some sense, you get to the core, the essence of that pre-trained model with this constitutional AI scheme. So a lot of interesting advantages to this that Anthropic goes into in this article. It does seem to lead to models that are less likely to succumb to like adversarial inputs, and they're harder to do prompt injection attacks and things like that. Anyway, Anthropic in this article also talks about their philosophy in designing this constitution. What goes in there? Like, what principles do you actually get your constitution to follow as you're using it to train this large language model? They talk about using the UN Declaration of Human Rights, among other things, Apple's terms of service, just because this is kind of funny. Like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, it doesn't contain anything about modern issues like digital privacy. And so Apple's terms of service actually do. And for some reason, Apple, I guess, is going to be the place that they turn for these things. Anyway, they also borrow principles from other places like DeepMind in their Sparrow principles, which was Sparrow was a system that they built to test some alignment strategies back in the day. So anyway, kind of cool and kind of interesting, because it all of a sudden it opens up a very transparent channel to evaluate the principles that are being baked into these systems through alignment. We have a plain English constitution that in principle, like anybody can comment on.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of this approach. Anthropic actually published a paper on this in mid-December last year, but they just published this blog post, Claude's Constitution, that includes a full constitution in it. Like you can actually read what they include, and that's why we have this article. And yeah, it's a very straightforward idea. It's basically like learning from human feedback, but instead of a human, you have another language model, and you know exactly what is baked into it. So they have things like, please choose the assistant response that is as harmless and ethical as possible. Do not choose responses that are toxic, racist, or sexist, that encourage or support illegal, violent, or unethical behavior. And above all, this instance response should be wise, peaceful, and ethical. So it's a loop where you have the ability to double check your output and make sure that you follow some principles. It's very scalable. It appears to work better than learning from human feedback. In general, it appears that if you're looking to align your model, something like this at least is a good thing to consider.
Yeah, and really interesting for the transparency it offers too. Like you can imagine, and they talk about this in the article. They're like, look, we're looking for ways to democratize this process, to gather people's views about what should go in this constitution. You can actually scrutinize it. With reinforcement learning from human feedback, all you're doing really is getting a bunch of humans to train a reward model that's going to be used to evaluate a language model's output. But like what goes into that reward model, like what that reward model actually ends up training a language model to do, that is totally inscrutable. It's just a black box neural network. Whereas here, at least you have some visibility. And so you can see what values are being baked in. One of the sort of more amusing things I noticed was they were talking about how they wanted to include sort of non-Western perspectives, non-Western values. And I was like, oh, interesting. Like, are we going to see stuff about, I don't know, Confucian philosophy or things like that? But no, it's a principle that says, choose the response that is least likely to be viewed as harmful or offensive to a non-Western audience. So it's sort of a somewhat brain-dead way of doing it, relying on the model's internal understanding of what a non-Western audience would want, but still kind of interesting. Like this is a first step, and they talk about how they're constantly iterating on their constitution and treating it as a living document, which is really cool.
Yeah, and the constitution is pretty long, so there's a lot to it, a lot more than you mentioned. But yeah, if you're concerned about AI safety, AI alignment, then I guess it's good to know that these big companies like OpenAI and Anthropic especially are looking into new techniques and scalable techniques for keeping things in check. And this from Anthropic is pretty promising. Next, another story, an AI scraping tool is overwhelming websites with traffic. So there's a tool called Image2Dataset on GitHub, and its creator, Romain Beaumont, has been facing some criticism from website owners who have had a lot of load on their website because of a tool, looking up and downloading images. It's a free tool, and you can basically launch it to automatically download and resize a list of URLs. We've seen this already done before for things like Leon and other data sets, but this is, I guess, allows anyone who downloads the code to do it. And this is a nice, fairly detailed article from Vice on how that has impacted certain people. There's a concrete example of the person who has the website Open Benches, where you can upload the pictures and locations of benches, host 250 gigabytes of photos, and they had to pay to scale up my server and pay extra for expert traffic and things like that for this bot.
Yeah, this really reminds me of that GitHub repo we talked about last week called GPT for free, where, yet again, we have an example of somebody open sourcing a tool that can be abused if you wanted to kind of induce massive processing power bills and expenses from third parties. And yeah, the ethics of this are really complicated. Like, do you really bear no responsibility for putting out there an open source tool that can do this, that could potentially, like, I don't know, ruin businesses? I don't know if I'd take it that far, but like definitely cause some harm. Yeah, I think open source is going to be an interesting policy area to watch in the next 2 years.
Yeah, and another aspect here is how it's implemented. So this image to dataset tool will scrape any website unless in the HTTP headers there are tags such as xrobots tag :no AI or xrobots tag :no index. So it's basically opt out. You have to modify the code of your website to opt out of this specific tool. And its coder, Romain Vivant, is very insistent that this criticism is not fair. It's for the best that we can develop AI, and it's selfish to not help unlock the potential of AI and open AI development. So yeah, kind of a thorny issue. I think definitely there are things to criticize. You shouldn't probably look for things that are copyrighted, of course, and it should probably be opt-in rather than opt-out, which this article goes into. But we'll see more of these kinds of projects for scraping the web, and basically any website owner now has to contend with people trying to scrape data for the AI. Onto a pretty dark story. It's titled "Mom, These Bad Men Have Me." She believes scammers cloned her daughter's voice in a fake kidnapping. So Jennifer DeStefano had a phone call from someone unknown, and when she picked up, she heard what sounded like her daughter that was kind of screaming and sobbing and seeming to be in much distress. Then a man claimed that they have her daughter and asked for a lot of money. And then, thankfully, after a few minutes, it was clear that this was a hoax. Daughter was actually fine. The dad, I think, called her and confirmed this is not happening. So this very quickly got resolved, but it also is definitely an example of what will be happening a lot.
Yeah, it's sort of funny because the stuff was hypothetical for so long. People would talk about like, oh, the malicious uses of AI. Soon X, Y, and Z is going to be possible, and here we really have one of the first very public examples of this being used. Imagining what happens when this sort of thing starts to occur regularly, when this tech starts to truly proliferate, become so user-friendly that it's a default part of the arsenal of scammers, hackers, and malicious attackers. Damn, we're going to have to rethink how we respond to phone calls. Yeah, I'm old enough to remember when my grandparents would get a scammy call from somebody trying to get them to buy some software, and it was all like very, very expensive for the scammers to do. But with an automated system that can do this, really changes the game in some fundamental ways.
Yeah, exactly. So we all will have to contend with more powerful scammers and understand how we can kind of defend against it. There are some nice tips in this article. As always, you can go and find the links to all these articles in the podcast description or on Substack. And one last thing I'll say is I think this points to it being increasingly important to have data privacy now. So you may want to set your Instagram to be private or your other social media things to be private, right? Because then if your voice isn't out there on the internet for anyone to download easily, then people cannot clone your voice and do scams of it. And
we're so fucked.
not gonna work for us, but I think for many people it may be the
Save
case
yourselves.
that you want to lock things down a bit more. Yeah. Last story in the section: bill would require disclosure of AI generated content in political ads. So we covered last week how there was an ad against Biden, an attack ad that was released that included entirely synthetic imagery. And then this Tuesday, there was legislation introduced that would basically require disclosure of AI generated content in political ads. Not too much else on this, kind of just covering the general idea of it. And not really surprising, I suppose.
Yeah. No, I mean, it seems to make sense. It's consistent with what a lot of people have been asking for and saying, like, hey, if you have a chatbot, for example, you should disclose that it's a chatbot, not a human being. This seems kind of related philosophically, and yeah, it directly pertains to the electoral process, which seems like something that could use some tightening up.
Indeed, and it does show how probably the government and laws that are being introduced are going to move fast in response to current events related to AI, right? This was very fast. It was just a week after this event.
Yeah, something that what policymakers actually can see directly tends to get dealt with a lot faster. That's why the grass is so green next to Congress.
And on to our last section of stories, art and fun stuff. First story is unions representing Hollywood writers and actors seek limits on AI and chatbots. So not so much fun stuff here, going to be a lot more on the artist side. So there's been a strike by Hollywood writers, by SAG, this SAG is the Actors Union. They also have had, I mentioned this, but this is writers specifically. And then in the demands for the strike on what they would do to be able to be employed, they wrote that they want to regulate use of material produced using AI or similar technologies. So they want to do some concrete things. It wants to ensure that no literary materials, scripts, treatments, outlines, or even scenes can be written or rewritten by chatbots, and ensure that studios can't use chatbots to generate source material that can be adapted to screen by humans. So yeah, pretty serious demand and not likely to be, let's say, accepted by the studios, I don't think. But maybe the tactic here is to ask for a lot and then maybe seek a middle ground.
Yeah, and kind of interesting, like what happens if this were accepted, because you could imagine like Hollywood itself basically getting outcompeted by a bunch of yahoos with open source tech using like ChatGPT to write scripts and Midjourney and all this shit to like actually produce. Eventually, like, we're not that far off. We have a lot of the raw materials started to come together for this stuff. So, if your position is going to be, we are not going to allow any AI generated content here, it's unclear where that leaves the competitive position of these large organizations in the scheme of things.
Yes, and in the context of AI, we've seen a lot of use of the term Luddite. Luddite is referring to, historically, it was actually an example of a movement, I think back during the first Industrial Revolution, where there was a new factory technology for producing, I think, clothing or material. And this movement burned down the factories and essentially said, don't automate or even improve our efficiency. This is kind of exactly the same thing. They're saying, okay, maybe we could use these tools to write in our process, but we just want to ban the technology entirely, and it should be just humans, even if it's less effective or less productive. I would say it's going too far. I think there's a lot of reasons why writers would want to use ChatGPT and other things like that. But again, this is a strike, so it could be just a point for negotiation.
Yeah, it's also a slippery slope, but like competition is inevitable. And if, it's not like it's a closed system and you can regulate from the top and cover every actor in the space.
Next story. inside the Discord where thousands of rogue producers are making AI music. So Discord, in case you don't know, is a place to essentially chat. It's kind of like a forum plus audio channel service. And this story covers how there is a Discord server named AI Hub, which hosts a large community of AI music creators that are behind some of these viral AI songs we've been covering. The service created on March 25th and now has over 21,000 users. This Discord is dedicated to making and sharing AI music and teaches people how to create songs with guides and even models that are used to create specific artists' voices. And people post songs and they chat about techniques and troubleshoot and so on. So yeah, it's kind of like a community space where people are just kind of tinkering and making stuff for fun.
Yeah, it's the new machine shop for the 21st century. It's like anybody can come in and just build what they want. But sort of cool too, because it does open the door to people with creative impulses, creative instincts, but not necessarily the technical know-how to make stuff the old-fashioned way. So we might see some pretty interesting new forms of expression in the medium.
Indeed. And a bit more concretely, there is both original tracks and covers. More or less, the way this works is primarily by cloning an existing artist's voice and then having them sing certain lyrics and then adding the music on top of it. So mixing kind of a more traditional way. And yeah, it's kind of a just for fun movement, but at the same time, we've seen a ton of these creations get pulled down from Spotify and YouTube because the industry doesn't like it. So,
well, and the copyright questions.
Yeah, exactly. The rules of this Discord include no illegal distribution of copyrighted materials such as leaks, audio files, and illegal streaming, and no violating anyone's intellectual property of rights. Is your voice your intellectual property?
Right, but that's the thing. Yeah. And that's the fundamental thing for so much of this art, so much of this, any kind of generative AI, right? I mean, like I think we're going to have some rulings pretty quickly. Like, what the hell do I know? I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice, but like, it seems like it would be helpful to have some sort of guidance fairly soon about the status of like the stuff from a copyright standpoint.
Totally. Next, very related, Spotify removes thousands of AI-generated songs. So this is not related to that Discord. This is actually about songs created by the startup Boomi that apparently is generating songs and apparently has maybe used bots to inflate the number of streams on Spotify. This allows you to create music with certain styles, so meditation or lo-fi beats. Supposedly, they have produced over 14.5 million songs, but a lot of this has been taken down. Apparently, 7% of the tracks by Boomi on Spotify has been taken down now.
Man, the gravy train keeps going. I mean, it's like I'm not surprised to hear that there's so much shaking up happening right now, because companies are even, there's no regulation yet, but companies are just trying to clean house right now in the first place, ahead of regulation, and just trying to figure out what's good for them. It's so anyway. This is a fascinating time to be tracking this stuff, and I feel a sense of like significant sympathy for a lot of artists, who are stuck in this position where it's like, is my work safe? Is my work a moat in any way? Like, yeah.
It's interesting. This startup was first created in 2019, so way before the really powerful models we have today. It works it's fairly limited. You just select a broad style and it gives you kind of choices, and you can tweak it or you can just reject and get this infinite stream of choices. So it's kind of similar to AI art. I don't think you can specify a general text prompt. You just give it one of a pre-selected set of instructions of categories. So it's pretty limited, but again, I'm sure they are working on making this more powerful now.
Well, and the 2019 thing too, it's easy to forget, but like we already had MuseNet in 2019 from OpenAI that was sort of starting to push in this direction, AI generated music. So I could imagine like a company starting back then, almost like anticipating the liftoff that's since happened in this tech. But anyway, kind of cool that it's all hitting the fan now.
It sure is. And then onto images. Amnesty International uses AI-generated images of Colombian human rights abuses. This is a pretty controversial story that happened. So a group from Amnesty International, as the article said, created synthetic images of police brutality in Colombia that they used in some Twitter posts, and people criticized it for various reasons. The biggest one is if you use AI imagery to generate these things, that could essentially discredit the legitimacy of other images that show human rights abuses, right? That's already something that people have trouble with when they post real photos of human rights abuses. People can claim that it's fake. Now, if you actually mix AI generated imagery in your coverage of human rights abuses, that could really undermine the credibility of advocacy groups more generally, especially those that are fighting against authoritarian governments.
Yeah, and completely agree with that perspective. That makes a ton of sense. Just pointing out that the image that we're looking at here, like you can tell that it is AI generated, like especially some of the faces in the background are a bit distorted in that. But overall, at a quick glance, like it does seem legit. And part of the erosion, the kind of epistemic crisis that seems to be upon us, where like yeah, we're going to find ourselves flooded, all our information channels flooded with this kind of data, knowing what's true and what isn't, like that's going to be really hard. And there's a bunch of different strategies people have proposed to deal with this kind of thing. There's like blockchain based strategies, like we've seen OpenAI look at proof of identity, or sorry, Sam Altman rather, through his like startup WorldCoin, trying to pin down people's identities because he thinks that's going to be really essential because so much can be faked in the future. And digital watermarking and like blockchain related strategies. But who the hell knows? I mean, ultimately, evidence can be fabricated, and at least in the medium term, I don't see that we have many solutions, technical solutions, to head this off.
Yeah, I think the nice thing here is you can think about organizational solutions instead of technical solutions. So Amnesty International doesn't actually want to fool anyone here. These were meant to be more just representative of what was happening, not intended to kind of fake real images. And I could see them just adopting a policy of, if you're using AI to generate illustrative images, have some text on the image that says, by AI for illustrative purposes. You could do this with watermarking, obviously, or like experimental or, beta process, a lot of the stuff. So I could see that definitely happening in this case, but more broadly, it does showcase kind of all different organizations, right, starting to incorporate these tools into their process and sometimes making mistakes.
Right. And the organizational level solutions like kind of work to some degree when you have responsible actors. But, I'm thinking, you have a despotic government that wants to undermine the public narrative around this stuff. And so, they pump out intentionally these fabricated images just so they can, call people out like don't cry wolf style when real images come out and kind of muddy the waters there. But
totally, yeah. For responsible organizations, there's also going to be needed some practices, but how to fight bad actors, that's a whole other challenge. And on to our last story. Midjourney 5.1 arrives, and it's another leap forward for AI art. So 5.1 just came out, and supposedly it's somewhat different from 4 and 5. It's more opinionated, meaning that you kind of get more stylistic things and more let's say, consistent results without telling Midjourney to do something. It will just choose to do something more dramatic and more interesting. This article includes a bunch of examples comparing, I think, 5 and 5.1, and you can see better quality, more dramatic images, better composition, better faces, a lot of stuff. And so, yeah, it's another improvement. And I think Midjourney really is very good from my experience, really good at photorealistic, at especially artistic things. So, yeah, very cool.
Yeah, I'm also curious about when this stuff sort of starts to reach a point of diminishing returns, because these images are so good. Like at some point, unlike text, where it sort of seems like text generating systems, you can keep extending and extending. And because language is so powerful and such a general purpose world model, like there's more value in making more scaled systems. I wonder if we reach saturation at some point reasonably soon, where just the marginal cost of scaling up these image generation models exceeds the perceived value that users get. We're not quite there yet, but I could see that happening.
That's true, and it's so insane to say that.
Right? Yeah, like
that's it. Text to image is solved. Oh my god. Alrighty, so that's all our news. And just to finish up, we are going to do this listener question segment for the first time. So hopefully we'll see how this goes and maybe keep doing it. This week from Robo0890 on Apple Podcast. I'm just going to read this out. I'm a high school student right now, and I'm hoping to one day major in AI. I was wondering if next week you guys could talk about AI as a career and what I should for in college and beyond. I'm sure we can talk about it for a long time, but we can try to be a little bit restrained right now. So it's actually, I would say, a high school is a good position to be in a way, where if you're in college right now or you're just starting work, so much is going to be transformed in the next couple of years. It's impossible to imagine, and a lot of people are going to have to be adapting very quickly, versus if you're not yet in college, you can sort of see what's happening now and prepare and adapt and think about it as this listener wants to do. So my take would be look into the jobs that are going to be not AI automated. There's plenty of articles you can look into with analysis on what is less or more AI focused. You can be a doctor, for instance, anything that's hands-on, anything that's facing people in person. So yeah, there's a lot of options, but there's also some fields you definitely probably want to avoid. And if you want to do major in artificial intelligence, that's pretty much computer science and programming. And a lot of colleges now have very good classes and programs for AI.
Yeah, it also kind of depends on the path that you want and the timelines that you have in mind. Like one philosophy that at least I've personally found, I've had a very weird journey. Like I dropped out of grad school and I started startups, and then I did a bunch of angel investing, and like it's a wonky path. But the one thing that I found consistently useful is to try to seek to do things that make you more valuable as a person. So in this particular moment in time, I think one good category is like experiment with building things with AI tools. As AI gets more powerful, the people who know how to use it well will have disproportionate leverage. And so you want to position yourself, if you can, to ride that wave, to be in a position to catch it. So make yourself, let's say, maybe good enough at coding to be able to evaluate AI generated code and like build little apps, play around with that sort of thing. It doesn't mean that you're going to be a software developer or whatever, more that you're in a better position to understand these tools, audit them, and just know what it means when a new breakthrough comes and how you can position yourself to capture the value that it creates. So a bit of an abstract level there, but.
Yeah, and I like your point that people take different paths. My original major in undergrad was electrical engineering, and I actually did study that in addition to computer science, and I was sort of just drawn to computer science. I worked for a bit as a software engineer before coming back to Stanford. So I also think, keep an open mind.
Yeah.
AI is very cool seeming, but actually working on it and majoring in it may be kind of boring, honestly, especially now that a lot of this is getting standardized and some of the open questions are not as relevant. And you end up doing things like machine learning engineers are setting up data pipelines and creation and model hosting. It's a lot of infrastructure and a lot of let's say pretty
Less sexy
code
stuff.
heavy, less sexy. You're not going to be creating ChatGPT exactly. It's kind of dry. So definitely still possible. You can study up computer science. You can look into becoming an expert in databases or in serving, real-time infrastructure, things like that. But just try things out. See if you like computer science and programming. See if you like something else that doesn't seem like it'll be disrupted by AI too much. And then you got plenty of time and you can keep an eye on what's happening. So I think you're in a good place.
Yeah, and maybe just to toss one last thought in, like maybe be wary of over specializing your skill set. And, especially think about your undergrad, that's a 4-year commitment. Think about how far AI has gone in the last 4 years. That's pre-GPT-3. Like that's 2019. I can hardly remember where we were at the time. And so, when you think about starting, whether it's an undergrad, a master's, a PhD, like these are long time horizon projects. It may not even be the right path. You may want to preserve your optionality and just focus on, can I get hired at a startup if I do a few months of like self-teaching and I'm very aggressive in my outreach and I try to find startups that just raised some money or something like that. See, I'm speaking as a tech guy, like that's kind of what I would do because that's what I'm interested in. But find the equivalent, wherever your interests lie. Get to explore what work life looks like, before you commit to something long-term like a college degree program or things like that.
Yeah, and I guess I'll also say one last thing, which is as a student in high school or in college, what you're really learning, what is most important to learn is the ability to learn and the ability to pick things up. Like you're not going to remember chemistry. You're not going to remember like CS theory. 90% of the stuff you're learning or more is not going to be in your brain in 5 years. But the ability to pick up concepts, think critically, do projects, all that is what you want to develop. So for me, one thing I found really valuable in undergrad was I didn't just do classes. I did clubs. I did the solo racing club at Georgia Tech. I TA'd. I did undergrad research. I did little hackathons. So in CS, I would say you have a lot of capability to do side projects and just try things that you want to make. And you shouldn't constrain yourself to just learning the official way. There's a lot of other ways to learn. Alrighty, so hopefully that answers that question well. And again, feel free to email us at contact@lastweekin.ai or comment on Substack or YouTube or Apple Podcasts, and we will pick a question, I think, and keep doing this. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But with that, we're going to close out this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully the audio quality is better, and be sure to keep tuning in.